Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our E101 Elevating Your Understanding of Air Permitting and Compliance for Grain Elevators. We have 84 registered attendees for our program today, and we know folks are probably still joining. So we're really excited for this first opportunity to do some outreach directly to the agricultural community. My name is Julia Wickard. I know several of you that have joined, and I'm excited that you're a part of this training today. At IDEM, I serve as the Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Program Support and also serve as the agency's Agricultural Liaison. I welcome you to this session, and I'm really glad that you've chosen to spend your afternoon with us. Agriculture is an important industry here in the state of Indiana, and providing information to help business and industry of all kinds is the duty, I believe, of state government. The farm value of Indiana field crops produced in 2019, which is the latest data we have, was $6.15 billion, and that grain must be dried and stored in grain elevators, both large and small, across the state of Indiana. So to get started, I just want you to know that we are recording today's program and training, and it will be made available later on our YouTube channel at the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. It will be posted there upon completion of the program, either yet today or probably more like tomorrow. And no Zoom meeting would be complete without some housekeeping items. So here we go. Please, we just ask that you not raise your hands during the program. The chat is open, and for all questions, whether you have them for a speaker, for our moderator that you're going to meet here in a few minutes, Crystal Wagner, with any of our panelists, you can put those in the chat and we will get to them at an appropriate time. We do ask that you stay muted and have your cameras off during the presentations so as to avoid any distractions to our presenters today. If you have not done so already, if you would like to edit your name on your profile picture, by hovering over your picture and then right-clicking, and then there should be an opportunity to rename yourself. And I guess you can be anybody you want to be, but we'd like you to be you. And if you could rename yourself, that would be great. So I also want you to know we do plan to take a 10-minute break following our permitting conversation before we move into compliance. So we will have a 10-minute break for necessities. There could be times during the program that we want to call upon you. And if we do call upon you, we just ask that you unmute your microphone and you turn on your camera. So now that we have the housekeeping items done, let's get on with the program. So on behalf of IDEM's Office of Air Quality and the IDEM Compliance and Technical Assistance Program, or also known as CTAP, I'd like to welcome you all to our program. As the agricultural liaison for the agency, many times I hear from the industry about topics that would be of interest for education, information, and training purposes. And today's program is an example of that outreach that we received initially from the Agribusiness Council of Indiana. So I want to thank Amy Cornell and the Board of Directors of ACI for sharing this idea with me, and then ultimately I want to thank my colleagues here at IDEM for putting this program together. We are really pleased to be able to present the program to all of the stakeholders who want to know more about air permitting and compliance for grain elevators in the Hoosier State. Our environmental education for regulated entities, or what we call E101 here at IDEM, is a free training series offered by the CTAP program that I spoke of earlier. E101 trainings are designed to educate individuals in charge of managing environmental responsibilities at Indiana businesses, but are truly open to anyone who has an interest in the subject matter. The goals of these trainings are to assist environmental managers in understanding current state and federal environmental regulations, determining how those regulations apply to them at their particular operation or facility, and then to demonstrate how to implement those practices that strengthen environmental compliance and sustainability efforts in their organizations. Today, you'll also learn about CTAP and its services and how it may be a welcome resource for all of you as industry professionals. Today's program will cover permit approvals for grain elevators, including permit by rule, source-specific operating agreements, and minor source operating permits. We will discuss common permitting issues that are seen at operations across the state. And today's program will also feature a discussion about inspections of grain elevators and what our compliance staff looks for during an inspection. We will talk about complaints, fugitive dust, and fugitive dust control plans and testing. So a little bit of everything for everybody. This afternoon, though, we will be focusing on more of those big picture items. So if you have a specific example or question about your operation or facility, our team of experts that you're going to hear from today, and many of those that are in the background, are ready to address those questions individually after the program. The last slide that will be up for a period of time in today's program will list all of the presenters and their contact information. So it will give you real-time information about whom spoke with you today. We really look forward to the discussion. So our first speaker is no stranger to air permitting in Indiana. Jenny Acker has 16 years of experience in air issues here at IDEM. She serves as the branch chief for the Office of Air Quality Permitting, and she started her career here at IDEM as an air permit writer. She served as a section chief for 5 years and has been in her current role for 3 years. She is a graduate of Purdue University, our land-grant university in Indiana, with an engineering degree, and in her spare time, she enjoys biking, kayaking, and spoiling her grandson. So I would just ask that you help me welcome Jenny to the program. Following Jenny's program and presentation, the moderator for today's training, Crystal Wagner, will introduce the speakers and will field questions. And I will join you again at the conclusion of the program. So welcome to our program today. And Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Let me share screen here for a minute. Okay, again, thank you to attending today, and I want to discuss some of the permitting options that are available for grain elevators. Again, as Julia mentioned, there are several options available. One is a permit by rule specific to a grain elevator found at 326 IC 2-11-3. There's a more general permit by rule available under 326 IC 2-10. We have a source-specific operating agreement called a SOA for a grain elevator operation. There's also minor source operating permits, that's an MSOP, a Part 70 operating permit, Title 5, and a federally enforceable state operating permit, a FESOP. I also want to discuss some of the common permitting requirements and applicable, potentially applicable state and federal rules. Okay, permit by rule for a grain elevator. This could be an option for you if, and there's 3 different options, if you receive by truck or rail, ship by truck or rail, and you can comply with an annual throughput limit of 11,000,002 bushels. A second option would be a grain elevator receiving by truck or rail, shipping by barge, and able to comply with 8 million bushels a year throughput. Or option 3, receiving by truck or rail and shipping by grain shipping. And there's a 5.68 million bushel per year throughput limit you would need to comply with. Okay. So it's not really clear in our rules exactly what is covered under a permit by rule elevator, but we can go back and historically look at the rule making itself and the calculations and see from that look back what is and what was intended to be covered under the permit by rule grain elevator. And it really is a simple grain elevator. It's an elevator that simply receives the grain and unloads it by rail or truck. Has simple handling operations, a head house, gallery belt, tripper that moves it directly to a silo for loading and then unloading from the silo to your load out. And again, that can be by truck, rail, barge, or ship. These were really designed for very small, simplistic grain elevators located within a county. What operations are not covered by a permit by rule for a grain elevator? Well, if you're doing any cleaning, drying, grinding, or milling, you can't operate under a permit by rule for grain elevator because those aren't covered. And there are other pollution emitting activities and equipment that you could have on your source that would not be covered. Potentially boilers, heaters, furnaces, dryers, generators, backup generators. Those activities are not covered under a permit by rule grain elevator. So with any of these activities on your source, you would not be able to operate under a permit by rule for a grain elevator. But if you do operate under a permit by rule for a grain elevator, there's some requirements. You have to operate and maintain your equipment properly, follow generally accepted work practices, don't discharge air pollutants so as to create a public nuisance, comply with any applicable federal, state, or local requirements, and upon request of IDEM, you need to be able to provide your grain throughputs for the previous 12 months in order to demonstrate compliance. Okay, some additional things about a permit by rule grain elevator. New sources are not required to obtain a construction permit prior to operating. So if you decide that you want to build a grain elevator that will comply with the permit by rule for grain elevators, you just do it. You actually don't need authorization or an operating sheet from us in order to operate your permit by rule grain elevator. But we do recommend that you go ahead and submit an application and get that sheet. It's going to give you the confidence and comfort that we do agree with you, one, and two, if an inspector stops by, you'll be able to say, here it is, we did apply, we do have it, and the air permitting branch has agreed with us. With a permit by rule grain elevator operating source, you can add, modify, or replace equipment or operations without informing us, provided that the grain elevator still qualifies for a 326 IC 2113 permit by rule, or it would still be a simple grain elevator. Okay. It does not have to be renewed, and there are no operating fees to operate under a 326 IC 2-11-3 permit by rule for a grain elevator. If you don't feel that you can comply with those constraints, there are some additional options. There's a general permit by rule, as we mentioned earlier, a registration, a CSOA for grain elevators, MSOP, BSOP, and Title V options. The general permit by rule requires that your source-wide emissions remain below 20% of the Part 70 major source thresholds without consideration of any air pollution control devices, and those could be your baghouses or bin vent filters. Typically, the 20% is 20 tons a year of particulate, PM, PM10, PM2.5, VOC, SO2, NOx, and CO. And there's some limits for HAPs that really won't apply to grain elevators. We do say typically because we do have 2 counties that are in serious non-attainment, and their 20% threshold is 10 tons a year for VOC or NOx. Grain elevators, we really don't feel that they're likely to qualify and be able to operate under a general permit by rule under 210. And the reason is based on our calculations, if you're a grain elevator with cleaning and drying, you would need to operate at an annual throughput of less than 330 bushels per year in order to stay below the 20%. But if you do believe you can operate under that, we encourage you to reach out to IDEM CTAP and discuss it with them. CTAP is confidential, but you do have the ability to waive part of your confidentiality. And if you're discussing permitting options with CTAP, waiving that confidentiality for that portion of your discussion allows them to have more open and less hypothetical conversations with air permitting, and we feel that's a better working relationship. Okay, the next level up would be a registration. For a registration, your source-wide potential to emit a particulate PM10, 2.5 VOC, SO2, NOx, and CO has to remain under 25 tons for 12 consecutive month period, again, without consideration of air pollution control devices. And for the same reason that we don't think that a general permit by rule is really feasible, we have the same problem here. Based on our calculations, the grain elevator with drying and cleaning would need to operate with an annual throughput of less than 420,000 bushels per year in order to operate under a registration. Again, if you feel that you can qualify for a registration, we encourage you to reach out to CTAP for further discussions. Okay, so now we're at our CSOA for a grain elevator, and that can be found, the regulations at 326 IC 2-9-6. And there's two options under this CSOA. The first option is a grain elevator with a storage capacity less than 1 million bushels, and you do not apply mineral or soybean oil, and you're going to have an annual throughput limit of 3 million bushels a year. The second option is a grain elevator with storage capacity greater than 1 million bushels, but less than 2.5 million bushels. You do need to apply mineral or soybean oil to grain at an application rate of 0.03% by weight or greater, and your annual throughput limit is 10 million bushels a year. Again, it's not very clear in our rules what is covered, but again, we can go back and look historically at the rulemaking itself to determine what would be covered under a CSOA for grain elevators. And the operations activities are a little broader than what you're going to find under the permit by rule for a grain elevator. So you are going to have grain receiving, unloading, grain handling, grain storage, grain cleaning, also grain drying, and grain loading ship out. For grain drying, though, please note that the only thing that's covered are the particulate emissions associated with moving the grain into the dryer. The actual emissions from fuel combustion are not covered under the CSOA, but we'll come down around here in a minute and talk about how we can cover those. So a source can apply for up to 4 different types of CSOAs, provided that the source-wide total allowable emissions, or PTE, of each regulated pollutant doesn't exceed the major source thresholds for Part 70 when aggregated. And typically, again, that's 100 tons per year or 12 consecutive month period. Additional CSOAs can be required for additional units at your source. Again, going back to that fuel combustion that is not covered under the grain elevator, you can get an external combustion CSOA, and that would cover the emissions from your fuel combustion. If you have internal combustion, stationary backup generators or generators, those could be handled and covered under an internal combustion SSOA. So we would issue one CSOA with 3 sub-CSOAs within it. Okay. What additional information or emission units can be included in your CSOA? Miscellaneous small equipment with combined PTE under the exemption thresholds can also be included in a CSOA. And you can find those exemption levels at 326 IC 2-1.1-3E1. And the exemption thresholds include 5 tons a year of PM, PM10, or PM2.5, 10 tons a year of SO2, NOx, VOC, and 25 tons a year of CO, and then a ton a year for a single HAP or 2.5 tons for a combination of HAPs. Some of the examples of items that'll fall under this exemption units: small combustion units, small boilers, small heaters, small furnaces, and small stationary generators and emergency generators can be tucked under this exempt level as part of your grain elevator CSOA. Okay. The requirements to operate under CSOA: maintain records of the type and amount of grain received and shipped on an annual basis. If you do opt for the second option, which requires mineral or soybean oil application, you'll need to maintain records of which type of oil is used, the application rate, and show your purchase orders. You will have an annual notification stating that your source is still in operation and in compliance with the CSOA terms and conditions, and you will have to comply with all applicable federal, state, and local requirements. Okay. So if you're a new source applying for CSOA, you will have to wait till the CSOA is issued before you commence construction. A CSOA for a grain elevator is considered an NSR CSOA, so a 30-day public notice period is required. So above putting the application together, it would have to go on to public notice for 30 days, and at the end of the 30 days, we would then be able to issue it to you. You can add, modify, or replace equipment associated with your grain elevator under the CSOA, provided that you still comply with what you are allowed to have on that CSOA. And you do not need an administrative amendment to add, modify, or replace exempt units. There are some permitting fees associated with a CSOA, and they are $5,556 for the NSR CSOA, which is a grain elevator. And if you have an NSPS or NESHAP review, and that review determines that an NSPS or NESHAP is applicable to your source, there is a $793 fee. NSPS and NESHAPs are what we call our federal rules. You may have NSPS DD. That would be an applicable NSPS. NESHAPs typically go along with your generators. There's 4I, 4J, and under the NESHAPs 4Z. If any of those are applicable to your source, there would be a fee for that. And a CSOA does not require a renewal. So if you've gone to this point and you don't feel that those are operating approvals that you can live with the limitations, we've got some other options for you. There's an MSOP, Title V, and a FESOP. The permit level thresholds for an MSOP, FESOP, and Title V are in this table. Note at the bottom it says this is not a comprehensive list of the pollutants. The additional pollutants tend to be things like hydrogen sulfide, lead, pollutants that really aren't going to affect you. And we've included this table just for reference, but we are going to go down and talk about some of the limitations in a few slides. So the first thing you would need to do if you want to look at one of these options is calculate your source-wide potential to emit. EPA has some guidance out there. It's been out for several decades. And for grain handling operations at a county grain elevator that primarily operates during the harvest season and receives 50% of its grain from farmers in the immediate vicinity during the harvest season, you can determine your PTE by looking at your past 5 years of grain throughput, multiplying it by 1.2, and using those as your throughputs to calculate what your potential to emit is. I know we have a few consultants in the audience, so I want to point out we typically do use AP42, and it is a factor that you multiply the grain throughput by the number of trips through your head. We typically look at moving from unloading into a silo is 1 trip. If you have cleaning and grain drying, you're going to have 2 or 3 trips total. Note that the PTE from fuel combustion at your grain dryer is not based on your actual past usage. It is based on max rated capacity, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I do realize that that's not feasible really for anybody, but that is the federal rules, it is our state rules, and that is how the PTE would have to be calculated. PTE from any other emission units activities other than the grain handling itself would be based on the maximum capacity of the unit at 8760 hours a year. And some of the examples may include fuel combustion in boilers, heaters, furnaces, fuel combustion in stationary generators used for non-emergency use. Again, EPA has provided us with some guidance on emergency generators, and that stipulates that for emergency generators, the PTE is based on max capacity at 500 hours a year rather than 8760. So if you're not a county grain elevator and you don't have more than 50% coming from off your location, that would be all other grain elevators and grain terminals, you're going to have to calculate the potential to emit of all your emission units based on a max rated capacity at 87 hours a year. And process bottlenecks can be taken into account when determining your PTE, although you do need to let us know what the individual max ratings are and where the bottleneck is so we can make that clear in the calculations of permits. Again, the PTE is not based on past actuals or actual hours of operation for these types of facilities. Again, AP 42 emission factors are typically used. For grain elevators and terminals, the PTE from fugitive dust must be included, and some of those activities would be tire traffic on your paved or unpaved roads, outdoor material handling, storage piles, and they may not impact your permit level, but they are always necessary to determine state rule applicability. Okay, so other permitting approvals after you've determined your PTE. An MSOP, minor source operating permit, and this is the one we're going to focus a little bit more on. Your unrestricted, which is your unlimited, uncontrolled PTE, is below the Part 70 major source threshold. So again, typically that's 100 tons a year. It generally has less record keeping than a Part 70 or FESOP. It does require a 30-day public notice and comment period. There's an annual $200 fee, and annual notification stating whether the source is in operation and in compliance with the terms and conditions in the permit. So that's at a minimum, that's going to be your record keeping. If your uncontrolled unlimited is above 100, you're considered a Part 70 source. Again, that's a 30-day public notice period and then a 45-day EPA review period. Annual fees are $2,381 is a base fee plus an additional $52.38 for each ton of actual pollutants during the year. And you will have annual compliance certification that addresses the source's compliance status with permit terms and conditions. If you're above 100 tons per year without limitations, there is an option to be a FESOP instead of a Part 70 operating permit, and that would require that you take limits to keep your actual emissions below 100. Typical limits you're going to find in a grain elevator would be grain throughput, fuel usage, hours of operation, a requirement to operate control devices for particulate. You will have monthly record keeping and quarterly reporting associated with the FESOP with your limits. In some cases, emission testing may be required. Your FESOP would require a 30-day public notice and comment period. There is an annual fee of $2,381, and you do have an annual compliance certification, again, addressing that you're in compliance with the permit terms and conditions. All these permit levels do require that you comply with all federal, state, and local requirements. From talking with Julia and CTAP, the feeling was we really need to focus on the MSOP permitting. So we are going to get down to MSOPs in a few years. Okay. If you apply for an MSOP, FESOP, or Part 70, you must wait for final permit issuance prior to commencing construction. If you transition from a permit by rule or CSOA to an MSOP, FESOP, or Part 70, you can transition if you feel that you no longer qualify for a permit by rule or CSOA. And for existing sources with an MSOP, FESOP, or Part 70 permit that want to add, modify, or replace equipment, a permit application must be submitted. And the level of the permit modification, revision, or amendment are dependent on the specifics of what you're doing. And that's also going to affect the timing of when you can make the change or construct the new equipment. So that's just a whole nother presentation, to be honest. We do have permitting fees for new sources, transitions, modifications, and revisions at 326 IC 2-1.1-7. Okay, if you decide that you need an MSOP or a FESOP, your initial MSOP or FESOP will be renewed in 5 years, and all subsequent renewals will be on a 10-year cycle after that. And Part 70 permits are renewed once every 5 years. Okay, so we're going to talk more about the MSOP. Again, it requires that your source-wide emissions for 12-month period be less than Part 70 thresholds without consideration of air pollution control devices and without any limitations. And again, typically that's 100 tons per month or 100 tons per year or 12 months. Okay. Based on the various MSOPs that we have issued with drying and cleaning, we've seen a maximum annual throughput capacity between 420,000 bushels and 2 million bushels. So that kind of gives you a range of your throughput capacities that would qualify for an MSOP. And do note that the source's required permit level is dependent on all the emission units at your source. So it could be 420 might not work for you and 2 million may not work for you either, but somewhere in that range. And again, if you believe you qualify for an MSOP, reach out to IDEM's CTAP or reach out directly to my office and we will help work with you on that. Okay. So if you do get an MSOP, what are the typical parts of an MSOP for a grain elevator permit? You're going to have Section A, and that's a source summary. That's going to talk about who you are, where you are, your name, your location, what's your county attainment status. It's also going to list all the emission units located at your source. Section B are general conditions applicable to all MSOPs. This is going to tell you when you need to apply for a renewal, kind of general information like that. Section C is source operating conditions. It may contain your fugitive dust emission requirements. Don't allow dust to go over the fence line. So those are operational conditions that you're going to find in Section C. Section D is emission unit operation conditions, and it's the requirements under our rules that are specific to the emission units at your source. Section E is federal requirements, and the last section are your reporting forms. So I want to focus more on the D, which are your potential emission unit operation conditions, and it's broken down into subsections. The first one is going to be emission limitations and standards. All grain elevators will most likely have a particulate limitation in them. The most common is 326 IC 6-3-2, and this is a process weight calculation. We simply use your process weight, one of two equations that are in the rule, and we come up with the pound per hour, and that is your limitation. You may need a bag house to comply with that limit, you may not, and that's part of our permitting process is to make that determination for you. There are some different limitations for different counties. 326 IC 6-5 and 6-8. If you note at the bottom, 6-5 are Clark, Dearborn, Du Bois, Howard, Marion, St. Joseph, Vanderburgh, Vigo, and Wayne counties. And 6.8 is specific limitations for Lake and Porter. Both these sets of rules have a green limitation of 0.03 grains per dry standard cubic foot, and we will require you to operate a bag house or a bin vent filter if you have one in order to comply with that. So one of those three rules will apply to your grain elevator. It's just a matter of which one, depending on where you're located in the state. The first, emission limitations and standards subsection under the D section will also have a requirement, a preventative maintenance plan that applies to all emission units and control devices. And the preventative maintenance plan is something you develop, keep on site, and work with your inspector to assure that it is adequate. There's some additional subsections under Section D. The next one would be your compliance determination requirements. In this section, we would require that you operate your control devices if necessary to comply with the Article 6 limit. There may be stack testing that's not very frequent in an MSOP, but it can happen. The next subsection would be compliance monitoring requirements. If you have a bag house, you have an option to keep a daily pressure drop record or to do a daily VE. Semi-annual inspections are required for control devices that vent indoors. You may have inspection requirements for baffles, slock sleeves, and spouts. And if you do have a bag house or filter, you're going to have a requirement that tells you how to handle a broken, failed bag detection or filter detection and the timing for your repair. The last subsection in a D section is going to be record keeping and reporting. Here's if you are doing daily pressure drop or VEs, you're going to be required to keep a record of those results. If you have to do semi-annual inspections, you'll be required to keep a record of those results and the date. Okay, please note that in the D section, these are state requirements only. So again, we've talked earlier about federal rules, NSPSs and NESHAPs. Those requirements will not be in the D section of your permit. They're going to be in the next section or the E section. Okay. So your E section will will contain your federal rule requirements. And the way that we incorporate those is we just simply put the citations that are applicable from the NSPS or NESHAP, and then we attach the entire NSPS or NESHAP to the end of your permit. Some of the federal rules that are typical at a grain elevator can include the NSPS DC for boilers greater than 10 MMBTU, NSPS subpart DD for grain elevators. Those have opacity, grain loading limits, and some testing requirements in them. NSPS subpart 4I for stationary diesel engine generators, NSPS 4J for stationary gasoline engines and generators. NSPS 4Z or NESHAP 4Z, that's going to apply to all stationary engines and generators regardless of the fuel type. NESHAP 6J is for boilers and area sources that are not gas-fired, so natural gas-fired are exempt from 6J. This would apply if you had fuel oil. There's also the NESHAP 6C. This is for gasoline dispensing at area HAP sources, which you would be if you're an MSOP. Otherwise, you wouldn't qualify. This is just simply if you have a gas dispensing facility on site. And just for reference, 7D, NESHAP 7D is if you're prepared feeds manufactured and you use chromium and or manganese. Okay, and the last section of your MSOP is going to be your reporting requirements. Everybody will have an annual notification. You need to submit it no later than March 1st, and it's going to just simply state that you're in operation in compliance with all permit terms and conditions, or you're not. There is also a malfunction report required for any malfunctions that last more than 1 hour. Again, keeping in mind these reporting requirements are state only. You could have additional reporting requirements contained within one of your NSPSs or NESHAPs that's applicable. Okay, and I want to conclude this by talking about some emissions that aren't included in your permit because they're not considered part of your source. Mobile sources, we typically call these tailpipe emissions. Cars, trucks, buses that may be on your site. The tailpipe emissions are not included. They're not considered part of your source. However, fugitive dust kicked up by these sources can be included in your permit and are considered part of your source. The other one is non-road engines, and we tell you where the definition of it is. A non-road engine is an engine typically that in and of itself is designed to be portable and it's certified as a non-road engine. It's something that you bring on your site and keep in one location for less than 12 months. You may need a backup generator temporarily. If you bring in a backup generator that's designed to be portable, carried on, put on your source, used for a few months or weeks, and then removed, that is considered a non-road engine and it is not permittable under the Clean Air Act, so we don't look at those. Also, if you have a crane, a bulldozer, that is a non-road engine driving that off-road equipment, the tailpipe emissions from that combustion engine also are not included. We really recommend that if you think that you're going to have an engine on site that's non-road and is not required to be permitted, that you reach out to us and have a quick discussion with us so we can confirm or deny and make sure that you do properly permitted if necessary. Okay, that concludes my presentation, and thank you, Julia.
Okay, looks like we have one question so far. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box on the right. And I'm going to go ahead and ask this question, but it looks like it's from Brad McCord. And if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask this question directly, you're more than welcome to. So his question is, could you give us a scenario with a grain elevator that has a dryer on what kind of permit would be needed. As an example, there's a grain elevator with 8 to 9 million throughput with a dryer.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that's regarding, but.
So, and I have to think back real quick. The SOA, I think it's a lower limit than that. So if you're going to use soybean application, soybean or mineral oil application, I believe you would qualify for one of the SSOA options, the second option. Depending on the size of your dryer, you may need a second SOA issued at the same time that would allow you to have the external combustion.
Okay, the reason for that question, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So the reason for the question is I'm a little confused because there's the permit by rule with the throughput was 11,200,000. And then we get into another section. I think the minimum was 400,000 bushel throughput with the grain dryer. So I'm just trying to get a little bit of clarity because that was an awful lot of information, a lot of different styles of permits, and it's hard to digest that real quick. So I was thinking, well, if I throw a scenario out there, we have a grain elevator, has a dryer, has just an example, 8 to 9 million throughput. Where does that fall into play? And is there some sort of flow chart available that would like say yes or no, and then follow that through that tells us which permit we need to apply for?
We could look at taking our presentation and making a rough flow chart for you. And, you know, at the end of all of our slides, we recommend that you reach out to CTAP or reach out to Air Permitting and talk with us, because there's just all kinds of little nuances in these rules. And it's really hard to say absolute anytime. But the fact that you have a dryer precludes you from using the permit by rule or a grain elevator. And again, that's part of the reason for the presentation. That's not explicitly stated in the rule, but it is implicitly implied in the actual rule making itself when we go back and look at the record. So the dryer precludes you from using a permit by rule for a grain elevator. The general permit by rule, I'd say your 8 to 10 mil definitely puts you over that. The next permitting level that you could look at with that, I believe, and I don't have my slides memorized, I'm sorry, but a SOA option 2 will allow you to go up to 20 mil. You would have to be between the storage capacity of 1 million and 2.5, and you would have to do mineral or soybean oil application at the applicable rate.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
And again, these slides are going to be, and the other materials are available after the presentation. So those slides are any other questions? I don't see any. So thank you, Jenny, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Daniel Roos, and Daniel has been with the Air Compliance and Asbestos Section as an inspector for IDEM's Southwest Regional Office for the last 4 years. Before IDEM, Daniel worked as a finished product line inspector for a furniture manufacturer. He attended Purdue University in the Natural Resource and Environmental Sciences program. In his spare time, Daniel takes a small group of cattle on his family farm. Daniel is presenting requirements for grain elevators. Daniel, are you ready?
Yep, I'm here. Just let me share my screen real quick.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, so as you said, my name is Daniel Rose. I am an air compliance inspector for the Southwest Regional Office for the Office of Air Quality. Today I'm going to cover the federal rule for grain elevators, as well as kind of air inspections and of permitted sites and kind of what we look for and what to expect from us. And then last, I will cover complaints about fugitive dust, because that's what normally would be the complaint that comes from grain elevators. So first, we'll get into the new source performance standard, or the federal rule of 40 CFR 60 subpart DD. Now, this rule is actually fairly simple, where most federal rules are, let's say, 50 to 100 pages long. This federal rule is about 3 pages long. So there ain't really much to it, but we'll kind of get through it. So main thing is this federal rule applies to grain elevators that were built after August 3rd, 1978, with a storage capacity greater than 2.5 million bushels of grain. The Clean Air Act actually exempts any county grain elevators that have a storage capacity less than 2.5 million bushels. So main definitions that are kind of go with this federal rule are the definition of what actually is a grain elevator, which is where grain is unloaded, handled, stored or dried. And then you have your grain unloading station, where portion of the elevator where it gets transferred into modes of transportation to take other places, or your grain loading station where it comes into the grain elevator. Now, the main kind of limits and rules dealing with this federal regulation deals with opacity. Opacity is the amount of view that is kind of obstructed by particulate matter, kind of like dust or kind of in the air. So it's kind of the percent being blocked. So as you kind of see from this little graph I kind of have at the bottom of the slide, if you have 0% opacity, that is nothing is blocking your view. It's a clear day. The further up percentage opacity you get, as you can see, 100% opacity means that you can't see anything through the cloud of particulate matter or dust. So for your truck unloading, for if you unload rail cars or when you load rail cars, it has an opacity limit of 5. As you kind of can see as well from this graph, 5% is not much. So if you're seeing even a little bit of dust in the air, you're probably around that 5% opacity limit. Grain handling has an opacity limit of 0. That's mainly because most of that is should be enclosed. You really shouldn't be seeing dust from the handling portion of the grain. Truck loading is a little bit higher with a 10% opacity limit. I think that mainly deals with as you're using, most people I've seen use chutes to load the trucks, you're going to get a little bit of dust from that free fall there. And then if barge and ship loading has the greatest amount of opacity, its limit, which is only up to 20%. Which still isn't much. So if you're starting to see dust, then you kind of need to look for ways to control it, whether it's control equipment or kind of other types of application. The federal regulation also deals with performance testing. So for if you fall under the federal regulation, subpart DD, you are required to do an initial one-time performance testing of your equipment. This needs to be done within 60 days of reaching maximum production rate, or before 180 days after your initial start of the facility. There are 3 different methods that you can kind of use for this type of testing. You have method 2, which deals with your volumetric flow rate of your air ventilation systems for your barge and ship unloading operations. This kind of deals with the PM concentration in the air. It tests that. You have method 5, which determines the particulate matter. And then you have method 9, which is the visual determination of opacity. So an inspector actually kind of deals with method 9s from our smoke school training, which we look at dust coming off certain sites, like dust coming off your roads, to kind of see what the opacity would be from that. All facilities, you must conduct performance testing, but you should not have to, or the federal rule at least does not require repeat testing. If you haven't completed any testing yet, that should be done as soon as possible. And that actually covers the federal rule. So now we're going to go into the compliance inspection. So the air compliance inspections are almost always conducted unannounced. Now with COVID-19 and everything going on, we have moved to having announced inspections for health and safety reasons. But once this pandemic is over, we will almost certainly be going back to unannounced inspections. Now these inspections are routine. They're always conducted during your operating season because we need to see at least 50% of your equipment running for the EPA to kind of accept our inspection results. Now these inspections usually occur somewhere at least between 5 to 10 years. They can be done more often, but as lower level permits like SSOAs and permit by rules, it's usually less frequent. Before we go on site, we always conduct surveillance. So this will drive in the area around the property to see if we can see if your equipment is running or if there's any dust leaving your property, which would be considered fugitive dust. We also conduct, other than our routine inspections, we conduct complaint inspections as well. Once we actually go on site, we meet with our source contact for the facility and have an opening meeting. During this opening meeting, we discuss kind of why we're there, figure out what equipment's running, and then kind of go over what the scope of our inspection is and kind of what we will be doing. So the first part of our inspections are almost always a tour of the facility. We go around and see, like I said, the equipment that's running, whether the control equipment is running as well, and then we look for, in this case would be opacity of certain points. So if you have bag houses, to make sure that they're running how they should, and there's not any dust coming from the bag houses. As trucks are driving on the roads, we'll look at if there's any dust being kicked up from that. And then for higher permits like the MSOPs, FSOPs, Title V's, there are more things we look at, like monitoring equipment, pressure drops, and stuff like that. All of our inspections, we are escorted by a source contact. We are never walking around on our own. So there'll always need to be someone there that kind of knows what the equipment is and can show us around. As we walk through a facility, we don't just look for any problems that are with air permits. We also look for other media issues, just like stormwater drainage for the Office of Water Quality, and then the Office of Land Quality as well. The other part of our inspection deals with records. So in this case, most of the records we'll look for are grain throughput records for the last couple of years. You're required to have 5 years worth of records on site, and we will usually look through about 2 to 3 years worth of records. We can look up to the 5 years of records if we need to. So we'll look through throughput records of your shipping and receiving. We also look through maintenance records to make sure that you're actually conducting maintenance on your equipment on site. And then with the higher permits, like I said, of MSOPs, FSOPs, and Title V's, there are usually visible emission records of certain points, as well as pressure drop readings and other types of monitoring. One other thing we kind of look for during our records review of if there are reports that needed to be submitted, like annual notifications, and we cannot find them in our database, in our files, we will ask you to show show the copies where you submitted those reports. After we go through our tour of the site and through our records review, we will then have a closing meeting with the source contact to go over the results of the inspection. If there's any violations or issues that we observed during the inspection, we will go over certain ways you might be able to correct those, and then we go over upcoming compliance dates, like when is your next annual notification due, kind of remind you of that. And then if the source or the contact has any questions at the end of our inspection, we'll kind of go over and try to answer their questions. All right, so for specifically for source-specific operating agreements or SSOAs, there are certain specific records we look through. We always look through annual throughput records for the last couple of years, and the SSOA permit requires them to be in bushels. I've seen some inspections I've been on, the records are kept in tons per year, and so we usually have to convert that to bushels during the inspection to make sure you are within the throughput limits of your shipping and receiving. And then, as Jenny stated during the permitting presentation, if you fall under that one option of SSOA where you have to apply mineral oil or soybean oil, then we look through those records to see the amount of oil that you've used, your rate of application, and then your purchase orders and invoices for the oil. SSOAs also require an annual notification to be submitted by January 31st each year that covers your compliance of the previous year. So it's just a sheet of paper that pretty much says, yes, we were in operation and we were or were not in compliance this past year with our permit regulations. The other main thing I'm going to focus on is permit by rules. These are the more basic permits, and so the only thing they require are your annual throughput records and bushels covering the previous 12 months. If possible, we want those to be able to see them while we're on site, but if you aren't able to locate them, the permit by rule does have a condition in it that within 30 days after you receive a request from us for information, you pretty much have those 30 days to get those annual throughput records to us. We then will look for records, maintenance records pretty much of your control devices to make sure that they are being maintained as the manufacturer requires them to be, and then that you're using accepted work practices that kind of minimize emissions. With grain elevators, that can deal with cleaning your floor, kind of OSHA type stuff, kind of all falls into some keep your emissions down. And then we look to make sure that no public nuisance is being created normally by fugitive dust. So some common issues that I've also ran into during my inspections is, one of the main things I almost always run into is a failure to submit the annual notification. SSOAs in this case, of course, are required for annual notification. Permit by rules actually do not require an annual notification. But this is a sheet of paper that you submit one time a year. So more times than not, I've seen people forget to submit the notification. So that's usually where a violation will pop up. Another violation that we tend to see are if a federal rule requires performance tests. A lot of times people forget the 5-year repeat test or even to conduct the initial test at all. And then, as also mentioned, there can be equipment on site that's not always covered by the permit. One of these things is gasoline tanks, which fall under the NESHAP 40 CFR 63, which is subpart 6C. main violations or issues I've noticed with gasoline tanks are there has to be a gasketed seal on the fill tank opening. I've seen quite a few places that forget to have that gasketed seal on, so that's where that violation comes from. And then generators. There are actually 3 federal rules that cover generators. You have subpart 4Z, subpart 4I, and subpart 4J, which each one kind of changes depending on what type of generator it is. With those, the main kind of compliance things you need for those type of subparts are there's annual maintenance that needs to be conducted on the generators. You got to keep fuel usage records of the generators, and then some generators, depending on whether their size or whether they're emergency or not emergency, those actually have testing required with them. So the next thing I'm going to cover are there kind of 10 tips to kind of look for that you can do to make sure that you are prepared for our inspections, as well as help the inspections go kind of more smoothly. The first and pretty much most important point is you need to be able to review and understand kind of what your permit is asking for. Whether it's opacity limits, throughput limits, you kind of need to understand kind of what your permit's asking. If you have any questions about your permits or compliance issues or anything like that, always call your inspector, your permit writer, or we have our Compliance and Technical Assistance Program, our CTAP program, which, as mentioned before, is a confidential service that you can call and try to kind of work through any questions that you have. CTAP also makes on-site visits, so they can actually come there, look at the records that you have, look at your equipment, and kind of help you figure out how to keep your records best, or what permit you might need and things like that. Another main thing you need to do is always make sure you have at least one person as a backup for compliance inspections. Like I said, we normally come unannounced. So if we stop by and the main contact you have for your environmental records is not there, that doesn't mean we leave and come back later. Most of the time we will still do our inspection and try to get as much information as we can. So it's always good to have a backup personnel available that kind of also knows the permit, knows kind of what equipment you have, what control equipment you have, and most importantly, kind of where your records are and how you maintain them. Which brings me to the next point of always know where your records are and always maintain them and make them easily accessible for anybody that needs to be able to review them. The other tips would be make sure you know where your permitted units are and where your control devices are. If you see something that's not in your permit that you think probably should be, make sure you get your permit modified to include that equipment. Because if we go there and we see equipment that's not in your permit or not covered by your permit, that then falls under normally what's called unpermitted equipment, which can, depending on the amount of equipment and their emissions, can lead to violations and or fines. If you have testing required, then always make sure you understand how often your testing is required and kind of what pieces of equipment needs to be tested. Always have a plan for when problems occur, because they almost always do, and then make sure you submit any reports that you need to by their due dates. So the next point I'm going to move to are citizen complaints and fugitive dust. For grain elevators, the main complaint we receive are for fugitive dust. Now, fugitive dust is when you have particulate matter or dust leaving your boundary lines at ground level onto usually an adjacent property. I've received quite a few complaints before about, the grain elevator working, dust is leaving the property, and it's interacting with nearby houses. That's kind of an example of a fugitive dust complaint. So once we actually receive complaints, what we do is we gather as much information as we can from the complainant. Then we will look through our records to see if this is the first time someone's complained or if this is an ongoing issue over the years. And then after we kind of do this prep work, we then will go and conduct surveillance of a property, whether we'll conduct the surveillance. Usually it's multiple times, especially with how weather changes. If it's raining one day and it's supposed to be dry a little bit later, we'll kind of go in between these times to see kind of as a normal day would be, if there's the amount of dust increases or decreases, or if it's actually leaving the property line. Once we've kind of conducted all our surveillance, we'll then contact the source representative, our contact, to kind of tell them that, hey, this past week or so, we've actually received a complaint about dust leaving your property. Do you kind of know what's going on? Do you have an explanation of what's going on? And then we'll also discuss if we saw any violations during our surveillance, and then ways that we kind of can resolve if there are any issues going on. If we can't get a hold of the source representative, we will pretty much go talk to corporate or higher ups, because we have to talk to somebody. And then the last thing we do is we call the complainant back and kind of discuss the complaint with them and how it has been resolved. And then if the problem then continues to occur after it's been resolved, for them to kind of call us back, and we kind of go from there. Some definitions I've kind of covered is, so you have your fugitive dust definition, which of course where it's leaving boundary property lines at the kind of at ground level, and then particulate matter, which is mainly, you can see that as kind of dust coming up into the air. One key thing to note, especially with grain elevators, bees wings are not considered fugitive dust, but they still should be controlled as much as possible. So here are some ways you kind of can do to control dust to make sure it's not either getting out of hand or leaving the property. One kind of way to do it is as your facility where it's transferring materials, you minimize the distance between that. The more air time or the more open air that you have getting to your grain and stuff, and grain and soybeans, the easier it is for a dust cloud to kick up or for the wind to catch it and move it around. Another thing that I've seen mainly used to help control visible emissions or dust is you use water or some sort of dust suppressant to kind of keep everything down, especially in the drier months. For your unloading operations, you can control them by either enclosing the whole operation area, or you kind of reduce that free fall distance. So if you have an open truck, make sure you don't have 3 feet of free fall distance is a lot different than 10 feet of free fall distance of keeping dust down. And the main place we see dust come from is the roads, unpaved roads, parking lots. Main thing you can do for that is either you, if it's an unpaved road or lot, you kind of pave it if possible, or if that's not feasible, use water and a dust suppressant that's been approved by our organization to keep your dust down. The main thing you want to remember, though, is not to overwater or use too much dust suppressant on the road, because once you start tracking mud onto the road that's not on your property, that is also considered fugitive dust. So you kind of have to find that good balance between keeping the dust down and not tracking mud onto the road. I've seen wheel washes used to kind of prevent tracking as trucks or semis leave the property. And that actually kind of covers most of our dust issues and compliance and stuff. Here actually, these last couple slides are kind of resources with links you can use. Like this first one here is where you can pull up the federal rule itself, and then kind of the history of the rule. And then our resources, we have kind of best practices. You can do little fact sheets to kind of help keep stuff down. And then you can look up ways to look up permitting, or if you have testing, here's also a link where you can look up kind of how information and forms for testing. And then the main thing to know is we have our compliance and technical assistance program. They're a good resource to use, especially for all your different types of questions, not just air quality, but land quality, water quality, and permitting as well. So that's actually all of my presentation, and here's actually my contact information if you need to get a hold of me. So now I'll leave it to Crystal for some more questions, or open it up for questions.
Thank you, Daniel. We did have a few questions come in. This one there might be a few more for Jenny. This one is from Randy Hoffman, and if a source is operating under the PBR rule under 2-11 for grain elevators and has a dryer on site with PTE below the registration thresholds, can they still operate under PBR?
Great question, and the answer is no. Although I do understand some states allow you to have different permits for different parts of your facility. In Indiana, you have a single operating authorization for your entire source. So you can't have a grain elevator permit by rule for the grain elevator and have a registration for the dryer. Everything has to fit under that one authorization.
Crystal, I think you're muted.
Who keeps muting me? All right, so the next question is from Jeff Cleveland, and the bracket of 1 to 2.5 million bushels for a SOA, does that include only permanent storage as defined in the NSPS, or does that take into consideration ground storage piles?
And another good question that this one I can't say no, I don't know the answer to. I need to go back and look at the development of the rule again. My initial thought is the ground storage piles are not included, that it's permanent storage. But I'm not going to make that call until we look into it.
Okay, and there's a few more questions. The SOA application rate for mineral oil is not 3%, it's 0.03%.
A little bit of a difference.
It's not as much as you think by weight. And then I had a question, this was in the, and I know Jenny answered this in the comments, but there's a question about feed mills, and are they exempt from permitting requirements?
No, not specifically exempted. They would have to determine what their PTE is and see what level they fall under.
And I've seen a few grain elevators that also have feed mills associated with them. Are there any special considerations for those types of operations? Do they need a source determination?
Yes, I would say so. So a source determination is, are you one source?
For permitting purposes.
For permitting purposes, you can't break it up and say, well, this is a feed operation and this is a grain elevator operation. So they're two separate, so we're going to permit them separately. If you own both of them and they're both on your property, there's a little bit more that goes into it. You have to look at the overall. So when we talk about a permit by rule for a grain elevator, that is a situation where the only emissions, your only operation is that grain elevator. Now, you know, you may have your agricultural farm, which we're not permitting, but the grain elevator operation is all that you have. If you have a grain elevator and a feed operation, that's not going to allow you to use the permit by rule, and you would have to calculate PTEs, and then we would have to go from the permitting level from there.
Very good. Our next question is also, looks like it's a permitting question. An annual compliance certification for a FESOP is certifying compliance for the previous year. Is an annual notification for an MSOP supposed to certify compliance for the previous year or current conditions? The form does not make that clear.
I just sent out an email to somebody to make that clear on the form. So it is for the prior calendar year.
There's a few more, hold on. Looks like Phil made a comment that if you're unable to locate your permit or the annual notification forms at the back of the permit, you can always find a copy of your permit in IDEM's virtual file cabinet or in the permit application search online. I have another question. This one might be for Daniel. Is there a list of approved dust suppressants? Or do you have examples of what people have used? In the grain industry, I usually just see the mineral oil.
Yeah, there actually, Jennifer Collins actually commented on that right under it. There is actually a list of dust suppressants.
And the link is included there in the comment.
Yep. And as Phil said, if you want to access, you have the items virtual file cabinet or the permits online. I actually included the permits online link in my presentation if you want to be able to find it a little quicker.
And just to clarify, the dust suppressant that we're talking about here in the link are dust suppressants added to the roads to keep fugitive dust down or potentially to storage piles, not mineral oil applied to your, yeah.
Okay, we've heard from permits and compliance, and now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you a little bit more about our Compliance and Technical Assistance Program, or CTAP, and what it is that we actually do. So our CTAP group is housed within the Office of Program Support. Jennifer Collins is our Pollution Prevention and Compliance Assistance Leader, or as I like to refer to her, she is the lead wrangler in cat herding with a CTAP group. And here I am within the CTAP group. I have over 20 years of IDEM experience, and I specialize in air issues. In a nutshell, here's what CTAP does. We provide free and confidential environmental compliance assistance to Indiana businesses, and our services are free and confidential, non-regulatory, and multimedia. As I said before, CTAP services are free. We help existing companies wanting to locate in Indiana, other government agencies in Indiana and other states. Consultants also contact us with questions. Sometimes we get calls from consultants that work outside of Indiana, and there's always questions about how permitting goes with our state. We are also confidential. We are bound by confidentiality per Indiana Code 13-28-3-4. We do not disclose to anyone, especially those on the regulatory side of the agency, our discussions with a company unless there is a clear and immediate danger to public health and the environment. And as a side note, that has never happened in the history of our program since its inception in 1995. So we take our confidentiality very seriously. We also are a non-regulatory program. We are on the non-regulatory side of the agency. CTAP is therefore, we have no authority when it comes to enforcement or violation letters or anything of that sort. Anything you divulge to us is kept in our confidence. CTAP is a multimedia program. We specialize in air, land, and water rules, permitting, and compliance. We can help you with pollution prevention and sustainability assessments, and we also assist with self-disclosures. Self-disclosures are when a regulated entity voluntarily discloses or corrects a violation of Indiana's environmental laws or rules. In those cases, IDEM can either eliminate or reduce the assessed gravity-based penalties and recommend that the regulated entity not be prosecuted if terms of the self-disclosure environmental audit policy are met. And there is a non-rule policy document on environmental self-disclosures, and that's under non-rule policy 04-R policy documents. We have those on the IDEM website. All the non-rule policy documents that are currently are on there. So our staff covers all of Indiana. We have 5 staff members in the regional central office, and then we have CTAP folks that take on the other outside areas. In the northwestern regional office, we have Charles Breitenfeld, and in the northern regional office, we have Joe Nucleus, and down in the Evansville area in the southwestern office, we have Heath Dill. And in the southeastern regional office, we have Andrew Dryden. And just looking at this, I noticed that we have over 120 years collective experience just in the central office alone. And that's a lot of skilled people right there. So we are a one-stop shop. Ask us anything. We can answer any questions you have, help you identify and complete any forms you might need, assist you with emissions calculations, grant information, or voluntary stewardship programs. Some of our services we have a new interactive web portal where you can access us. We also offer on-site assessments and virtual and in-person training. And we also have a healthy amount of online resources and learning materials available on our website, free to you. The new portal is really exciting, and it is available through Access Indiana. It is an exciting new tool that we started using this last year. And you can use the portal to confidentially ask us questions, request a site visit, and even collaborate within your company or with your environmental consultant. Access through the portal is through Access Indiana, and the web address is portal.idem.in.gov. That's a quick, easy address. You can just type that in and go straight to the portal. Hold on. As I said, this is with Access Indiana, and you may already have an Access Indiana account for other services like with the Department of Revenue or Indiana Tax Pay. Even the DNR has an Access Indiana account for camping reservations. All it takes is your email and password to access all of these, and you see the CTAP access on the second row on the far right side. So the portal here in Access Indiana, if you're accessing the CTAP online portal through IDEM's electronic services, this is what it looks like, and you just click on that CTAP button up in the top left corner. As far as site assessments go, you can request a site visit, either call us up or directly through the portal. If you're requesting a new case through the portal, there's a place near the bottom of the electronic form where you can request a site visit and then submit it to us. They are free and confidential. Site visits can be in person or virtual. And during a site assessment, CTAP will help you identify any of the applicable rules and associated compliance requirements that IDEM that might apply to you through IDEM, including record keeping and reporting. And we can also troubleshoot any issues you are having or help you identify pollution prevention opportunities. So why have a site assessment? The biggest benefit from a site assessment is that we can help you identify violations before you have an inspection. We can review your records and make recommendations, and our goal is to help you remain in compliance and avoid enforcement. That's our #1 goal, is to never see you in enforcement. So if we can help you do that, we are there for you. So another thing that we offer is free training, just like this one that you are attending today. This CTAP website has all of the E101 information for upcoming training, including the training slides, materials, and recordings if they're available. And today's training is industry specific. You can also see the website for upcoming webinars and E101's training and E101 trainings, and let us know if you have a topic that you would like to cover. So 2 weeks from now, we will have our next E101 training on March 16th, and this topic will be cultivating your understanding how to prepare and handle environmental spills and emergencies in agriculture. Future topics include environmental restrictive covenants, understanding National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems or NPDES permits from a business perspective. This one's going to be a good one. Mark your calendars for this one. We don't have a date, but it's coming. Portable air units and how they are permitted. That's another good one. Toxic release inventory, TRI, and PFAS, PFOA reporting requirements. That will be also another good one. And then stormwater related to metal parts manufacturing. Those will coming up. Hopefully be coming out later this year, so check back with us on that. So CTAP's website also has, in addition to upcoming training announcements, you can also find fact sheets, regulatory updates, pollution prevention resources, and links to other external resources. Anyone may contact us at any time. As you are preparing to meet with us, here's some information you can gather to help get you started. Things like the business type and location, your primary SIC code and NAICS codes, your core operation, the type of equipment you use, what kind of processes you have and the materials that you use in your process, the types of products that you manufacture, and other services that you may provide. Process flow diagrams are great, and a description of what it is that you actually do. The anticipated or known potential emissions to air, water, and land. Waste types generated and management practices and material storage information for process and waste. Existing environmental approvals, if you have any details about expansions or modifications to your source, and any construction details and timelines, those are also very helpful. And any specific questions that you have for us. Those are great ways to prepare. So in addition to CTAP, the Office of Program Support also has, so a big part of OPS is also the voluntary programs. Partners for Pollution Prevention is the biggest of them. So Partners for Pollution Prevention includes industry, businesses, government, and others that implement and promote P2 ideas and business practices. P2 includes innovations for waste reduction and environmental stewardship in Indiana. Members enjoy many networking and recognition opportunities. And also, this is yet another exciting update, is that the 24th annual P2 conference is coming up in September 23rd of this year, and the theme is Unmasking Your Pollution Prevention Possibilities. This is scheduled as an in-person conference and trade show, and hopefully we will see some of you there. Another volunteer program is our Environmental Stewardship Program. This is a more selective program than the Partners for Pollution Prevention program. Sorry, I'm behind on my slides. The Environmental Stewardship Program is based on performance and recognizes and rewards companies for their environmental compliance. Members must have and maintain an environmental management system, and applications are accepted during 2 enrollment periods a year. The spring application period starts April 1st and ends May 31st. Contact the program manager, Jean Fix, for more information. Her information is at the bottom of the slide. OPS also handles the Governor's Awards for Environmental Excellence. There are seven different categories on the Governor's Awards. Cameron Machino is the program coordinator for Governor's Awards. The deadline for this year's nominations is April 5th at 5 p.m. So get those nominations together. Get a little bit more time. So another P2 grant that is available to manufacturers is through an IDEM partnership with US EPA and Purdue University. And Kelly Wager at Purdue University, she is the lead service manager for sustainability, and she is in charge of this grant. Applications are now being accepted, and there is no deadline at this time for this program. A recycling grant is also available through the Recycling Market Development Program. Grants are a 50% cash match from $1,000 to $250,000. Grant projects that we have seen in the past include starting a company recycling program, projects going to zero landfill for solid waste. Grant proposals are accepted starting this spring, and look for further information on that on our website about this grant availability, or you can contact the RMDP grant manager, who is Deanna Garner, and her information is at the slide on the bottom there. And the last grant that we have is a community recycling grant program, and grants are accepted from, there's a 50% cash match from $500 up to $100,000. And these are community grants that are eligible for solid waste management districts, counties, municipalities, schools, and nonprofit organizations in Indiana. Contact Allison Taylor. Her information is in the box on the side there if you have more questions or would like to know more about the community recycling grant program. And we are now accepting applications through March 1st. So that deadline is coming up soon. And you can contact us anytime. This is the CTAP brochure. Here's a link to the PDF of the brochure if you'd like to look at the full information. And this is my contact information. You can call me anytime or access me through the portal.idem.in.gov. Any questions on our program? I do not see any questions, so I'm going to send it over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Crystal. Appreciate it. So as we wrap up today's E101 program, we certainly hope that you have enjoyed the discussion and have been able to acquire some information and take something back to your facility or to your organization. I think as you've heard, air permitting and air compliance issues are complicated and are site specific. So as I indicated earlier in my opening remarks, today's program didn't necessarily give you everything specific for your individual organization, but we do want to hear from you. We want to hear about your individualized questions, things that you need to know to make sure you are in compliance, and whether you want to communicate directly with the Office of Air Quality, or as Crystal indicated, our CTAP staff. We are here to certainly help you navigate kind of the regulatory world. The slide that's in front of you on the computer shares with you the speakers that you heard from today and their contact information. And as we indicated earlier, this also will be a part of the recording, so you can go back and get the information. You can talk with the Office of Air Quality staff that spoke to you today. You can talk with CTAP. You can call me. I'm the agricultural liaison and have confidentiality in my job description as well. The decision is truly yours, but whatever you decide, know that we want to hear from you and we want to help you navigate the regulatory world at IDEM. I would just ask that you help me at this time in thanking Jenny, Daniel, and Crystal for their presentations. And normally we would have a lot of applause at this point, but we'll do that virtually. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Jennifer Collins, who is the manager of our Pollution Prevention and Compliance Assistance Program here at IDEM, as well as our executive assistant, who I also call the wizard behind the curtain, Kristen Coasters. I think you might have heard her voice as she has helped present this information to all of you. We do ask you to be on the lookout for a follow-up survey, and this will come to you in the email that you provided when you registered. We need your and ask for your candid feedback and comments, as this helps makes future programming possible and makes it more relevant to the customer, that being you. So we want it to be meaningful and helpful. So with that, I thank you for joining. Certainly wish you a great sunny day, safe planting season, which is just around the corner. And thank you for helping to feed the world. Have a great day.